we're going to start looking at how we influence each other. So this is all about when people maybe convince you to do something, or they're trying to persuade you to commit to something, or things like that. So this is one of my favorite things to start talking about, because once you start understanding some of these processes and how they're effective and why they're effective, you might actually start noticing them in your everyday life. Things like people trying to sell you stuff, a lot of those techniques and compliance techniques are going to sort of start showing up. And once you understand them, it's actually harder for them to trick you, which helps you be a little bit more protected in those situations as well. So interesting on many levels, for sure. So when we're looking at influencing others, of course, we like to categorize this and decide why somebody might be trying to influence you. So we're going to talk about 3 basic motivations to try and influence people socially. But first, we should probably define social influence, since that's our MO. So social influence is our ability to change or direct another person's behavior. So you're motivated to make them do something different than what they're doing presently. So we're going to look at hedonic motives, approval motives, and accuracy motives. And each of these is going to have sort of their sub-explanations. So starting with the hedonic motives, so you've probably heard the term hedonism. So that's when you're focused on sort of obtaining good things and avoiding bad things. And it's usually simplified down to the pursuit of pleasure. So you want all the stuff that makes you feel good, all the stuff that you enjoy, and you would like to not feel bad or guilty about things. So if we think about it, that's kind of a more thought sensitive way of talking about things like our operant conditioning back with our behaviorists, talking about doing the stuff that leads to good consequences and avoiding the stuff that leads to bad consequences. Very similar framework, except usually when we talk hedonism, we're typically talking about sort of a more conscious aspect, though it doesn't have to be. So you can keep that in mind here. But yeah, so seeking pleasure is a fairly basic motive. And this is something that we see in a whole bunch of different ways, pretty much everywhere. So that operant conditioning example is something you see often. And it's as simple as stuff like parents trying to get their kids to do what they should and not do what they shouldn't. Things like time out. Time out is technically removing something enjoyable, which leads to a bad outcome. So children should be less likely to do stuff that gets them a timeout. We also have things like praise, or if you got a cookie or a sticker for doing something you're supposed to, you're getting reinforced. You're getting something good for doing good behaviors, doing desirable behaviors, making you more likely to do them again. So here we're seeing that that's fairly easy to employ. And if we tie this back to, again, an earlier discussion, when we talked about morality, and how people make determinations about what is right or wrong, actions they should or shouldn't do, we talked about that progression. And I think that was when we were looking at Kohlberg and those 6 different subsections, sort of our 3 broad categories. Whether you are motivated by what is good or bad based on reinforcement, what you can get away with, or what makes you feel good, then it's sort of these are the rules that I need to follow. Then you're a little bit more broad and you get into starting to think about, what is your definition of right and wrong, oftentimes based on others. This slots into that really nicely. So if our motivation is what we can get away with or what makes us feel good, that lines up with this type of influence. We also see this in other ways. So parents and punishment for bad behavior, reinforcement for good behavior, but also think about things like governments controlling behavior with laws, what you are and are not allowed to do. So people avoid doing things that will get them punished. So you probably avoid speeding, at least in places where you could be caught for speeding. It's one of those downsides of those traffic cameras. If you know where they are, it's a lot easier to avoid them. But that's sort of a caveat with that kind of learning. A couple of terms related to this, we can look at our over-justification effect. This is an interesting one that happens when somebody receiving a reward actually ends up decreasing their intrinsic motivation to perform that behavior. Now, first thing, intrinsic. Usually we talk about this intrinsic versus extrinsic. Intrinsic is internal motivation. Extrinsic is external motivation. So if somebody else is providing you with a reward, with a reinforcer, that is something extrinsic. Whereas if you're doing something because it is intrinsically enjoyable, then you are internally motivated. And there's a lot of different discussions on motivation and internal versus external, but internal motivation is something that's sort of more close to your heart. You do something because you enjoy it, and that usually leads to you being more persistent in engaging in those actions. Whereas extrinsic motivation can be good to start, but we're then sort of reliant on that external validation. So if a kid cleans their room because their parents will take them for ice cream if it's clean, if you stop taking them for ice cream, they're going to stop cleaning their room. So now they're only doing it because they want that reward. And eventually you're going to find that they are less likely to do it if they don't get that reward. So we lose some of that intrinsic motivation because, well, I only want to do it for that external thing. This also ties to maybe you're like me and you were going to do the dishes, but somebody comes in and says, hey, can you do the dishes for me? I really need you to do that. That would make me happy. And then you're like, nope, that's not happening. I was ready to pick up the sponge, and now you have told me that I need to do this to make you happy, and all bets are off. I'm not doing this. So I would have been content on my own, intrinsic motivation, I was all for it. But as soon as that external force comes in, not so much. So this is sort of showing that, and the fact that it can happen a whole bunch of different ways, but sometimes that external force makes us less likely to do it for ourselves. And if we're doing it only for external forces, we're less likely to do something consistently. That's where we get into that idea of, I'll do it, but only if I get that reward. Or I'll do it when somebody is around to see it, so I get that reinforcement. But if they're not present, I'm going to change my behavior. So you start getting conditional actions, things like I will obey the speed laws if there's a possibility of a speed camera or a speed trap of some kind. But if I know that I can get away with something, I'm going to change. So that's all tied together here. We also have something called reactance. We're going to drop a bunch of different terms that are related to these concepts. But reactance is that unpleasant feeling that we get when someone is coercing us or trying to encourage us to do something. Kind of like that, as soon as somebody tells you that you need to do the dishes, you kind of get that, I don't want to, I want to push back on it. That's one of those situations. So you can use that term in that case. But basically, as soon as we realize that somebody is trying to change our behavior, we're usually likely to push back against it because of this feeling where we're kind of uncomfortable about it. So what else do we have? We have approval-based social influence. So if we're talking about approval motivating our behaviors here, so now we have motivation to be accepted and to avoid being rejected. So this kind of makes sense. People being with other people, we want that social support. Acceptance is a really powerful motive for people because we rely on other people to keep us safe, so that we feel like we belong, so that we have part of a group, so we get support and solidarity. All of that is really important to people. And if we think about some of our humanistic perspectives from earlier, that sort of striving for belonging and acceptance and social support is definitely part of that path. So we would like to belong and we would like to feel like we belong. And one of the ways that we can do that is by matching the actions of those around us so that we do fit in with our groups. So a bunch of terms here, and you're going to find lots of repetition. So we'll start by talking about norms or social norms, which leads to normative influence and so on. But our social norms are just customary standards for certain behaviors that members of a culture will widely share. So in this case, our social role or social norm is how we're supposed to behave in a particular setting based on what is normal for the group we're in. So my favorite example of this, again, I'm sort of pulling images to get my favorite examples. You have social norms for how to use an elevator. Now, if you get onto an elevator and there's somebody else there, you will automatically both gravitate to opposite corners, usually at the back of the elevator. You're going to spread out, give each other some room. Maybe you do that sort of awkward head nod to acknowledge each other, and then you will fix your attention as far away from each other as possible. That is the standard. Now, if you wanted to weird people out without it actually being, say, problematic, you get into that elevator and stand in the same corner as them. You leave tons of space around them and you go stand within sort of their personal space. And everybody is now really uncomfortable, both you and that person. And that's because you violated those social norms, these unwritten rules of how you're supposed to act. Interestingly, different places will have different rules. For me, I feel awkward if I strike up a conversation with someone. But in other countries, I think this is sort of the sort of Nordic countries, you're expected to acknowledge them and start a conversation. Usually something sort of generic of how are you doing or lovely weather we're having or whatever, but it's actually rude not to acknowledge the person beyond that. I like the example of when I go from my home in Nova Scotia, where my parents still are, back here in their small community, you know everyone. And if you don't know them, you're related in some way, shape, or form, or they know someone you're related to, so you wave. As you drive past, you wave to everyone, smile and wave. And if you don't wave, they assume you're an out of towner. But if you come here and wave to people as you drive past, they give you that look of what's wrong with you. So different standards in different places, and it's all about sort of matching what other people are doing. All of those relate to these social norms. And within that, we can also talk about social roles. Again, interrelated concepts here. But social roles are made up a bunch of these different norms, social norms, that help characterize how we're supposed to act in certain conditions, basically when we take on certain roles. So again, examples of this would be when I'm teaching a class, I have a role of an instructor. So I'm supposed to talk a certain way. I explain things a certain way. I sort of have a certain demeanor about me, things like that. But if you bumped into me while, say, out and about, this is always sort of awkward reaching into a situation where you're in a different social role. Say you go to a restaurant and you bump into a former student, or for you guys, you bump into one of your instructors. And you're like, this is weird. This is a different setting. You're not acting like an instructor. You're with friends, joking and laughing and having a few drinks and having dinner. That's really weird. And it feels weird because you're seeing someone in a different role. And therefore, their standards of behavior are now slightly different. If you want a different example you might relate better to, think about how you act when you're around your friends versus when you're with your parents. And then what happens when you have your friends and parents get together? So if you have friends over and now you're in that situation of, do I laugh at that joke or is that going to get me in trouble? So you have this sort of jutting up of two different roles where they have different rules, different norms, and you almost have conflict trying to decide how you're supposed to act. So these are all different ways to think about how we know how we're supposed to behave. And the times when we're uncomfortable because we don't know, that almost makes those roles even easier to identify. Now, the last term on here is going to be normative influence. And this is something that's going to keep coming up throughout the rest of this section. But this is when somebody else's behavior ends up giving us information about what is appropriate. So we can actually use normative influence to develop our social norms. So you go to a new place and you're not quite sure how to act. So you watch how other people act. I've actually used an example of this without naming it because I always forget proper titles. But when I mention the fact that they've changed over access to the buildings for the summer, and you need to tap your card to get into a building. So I hung back and watched somebody else do it to see what are the actions you're supposed to be engaging in. I use it as an example of modeling behavior, but it's also good for determining what the standards are. How are you supposed to act in this situation? So I get to see how other people act, and I know that if I copy it, I'm going to sort of fit in with what's standard for this situation. So this could also be something like you show up on the first day of class and you don't want to be the first person in the room. So you wait for somebody else to come in and get set up, and then you can do the same. So normative influence is when they're giving you that information about how you should act, and then you can adjust your own behavior accordingly. And that gets you some experience on some of these norms and even some of our social roles if you can find someone who embodies the same role that you're supposed to be taking on. And then that gets us into our compliance discussions. So different types of compliance measures, techniques. I think techniques is probably the better term. There are tons of them. And again, we've talked about some of these without proper names yet. The first of these is our norm of reciprocity, which actually came up talking about our altruism, where if you reciprocate, you are sort of paying back or balancing the books. So this norm of reciprocity is all about treating others how you want to be treated, but it means that you feel obligated to pay back someone's favor. Maybe you've gone out to dinner with friends and somebody has picked up the bill. They did that thing where they run to the bathroom and then they come back and they've paid for everyone's meals. And now you feel like you owe them to pay for the next meal that you get together for. So that could be influenced by this norm of reciprocity. This can also be a situation of putting yourself in someone else's shoes. I'm motivated to do this for them because I would like them to pay me back in the future. It can be framed from either side. But if the goal is we want reciprocal helping or paying back of favors, that can be a motivator for actions. And you can tie into this, sort of use it to your benefit if you want someone to do something for you. So you might remind a friend of all the stuff you've done for them and then ask them for a favor, increasing their likelihood of agreeing. Next, we get our foot in the door technique, and this kind of ties in. You'll find these interrelate pretty nicely. But the foot in the door technique is kind of what it sounds like. You would like to sort of inch into the situation. So kind of like somebody opens the door for you and you get one foot in the door and you can build on it from there. So here, our persuader, the person trying to influence the behavior of someone else, they obtain initial compliance from a small request. I've used the example of coming to class and asking somebody to borrow their pen. That's pretty innocuous. I don't mind sharing a pen, no big deal to me. Then you follow up with larger requests. Okay, second day, can I borrow a pen and a piece of paper? It's still reasonable. It's not much more than yesterday, so sure, I'm all for it. Then maybe you have an ask of, can I check my notes against your notes from the last class? What about then we work up to, can I share your cheat sheet for the final exam? You've built from small requests and then creep it up into larger and larger requests. And we almost feel obligated to keep saying yes because we've said yes in the past. And this isn't technically that big of a step from what I've already said yes to. And once you're into that sort of pattern of saying yes, you even feel worse to say no than if you'd said no to begin with. So in this case, they've sort of played on that feeling of guilt to change your patterns and your likelihood to continue a pattern of behavior to try and get you to say yes to larger and larger things. This could also be something like if somebody's getting you to sign a petition. So you sign their petition and they're like, well, hey, now that you're here, would you like to give a small donation? And once you've given a small donation, would you maybe agree to sponsor something? So you've crept upward from a small commitment to something much larger. So compliance is just agreeing to some sort of a change in your behavior. It could be a commitment. All those terms I'll end up using interchangeably. Now, if we've started foot in the door, this is, start small, expect them to say yes right off the bat and build it up, continue saying yes. Another one is the door in the face technique, where basically you walk up and you intend to ask for something outrageous, where they will initially say no because that's absurd. So our persuader starts by making a large request and you expect a refusal. So I'm going to walk into class and I'm going to ask if I can copy your answers for a bunch of quizzes. And you're like, well, no, that's absurd. That's cheating. No way. But then I'm going to follow up with a smaller request. So now I'm going to ask you, okay, but could I then look at your notes that helped you study for those tests? You're like, well, that seems reasonable now. If they had come right out and asked to have your notes, you probably would have said no. But because we started with such a big request that was sort of absurd, you're now feeling like the second request is more reasonable. We've basically put it into different perspective. We've framed it in a different way. So by asking something absurd to start, we're now making everything else seem more reasonable. This is like if you go to one of those, again, donations are a strong example of this. So somebody's advertising for a charity and they ask, hey, can you donate $100 to this particular charity? They're like, absolutely not. I am a poor student. I can't afford that. And they're like, okay, well, what about we round up your total to the nearest dollar? So you're going to donate like less than $1. Would that work? And you're like, well, yeah, that seems really reasonable. I might have said no to begin with. Maybe I was cash conscious, but now this seems really reasonable to me. We also want to keep in mind people don't like saying no. It can make us uncomfortable, and having to say no repeatedly, especially if the second situation is a little bit less intensive, it seems more reasonable, we're going to feel even worse saying no again. So this is a pretty strong one to motivate us to say yes to less strong requests. And then the last one here is lowballing. And this is something you encounter, and I didn't realize this is what it was until teaching this class. But this is when your persuader gets somebody to commit to something that's reasonable, but before you actually end up sort of handing over and finalizing this commitment, they start adding things to it. So we increase the cost of the action. So I'm going to ask if you want to get points with whatever purchase you're making. It's a free card. You could totally sign up. You're like, yeah, okay, sure. I don't mind that. Like, it's just saying yes. They're like, okay, in order to do that, though, I need your email address. And we're going to send you all of these advertisements. And you have to say yes to those in order to get the free thing. You're like, well, I wouldn't have signed up for advertising, but fine, I guess that's all right. And then you start getting more and more. I've mentioned before, I think, I worked at Best Buy for my entire undergraduate career. I only did cashiering and customer service, so I get to do all the fun stuff. But you get to watch the salespeople. They're like, oh, you're going to buy this lovely new TV. But, if you have a new TV but don't have an existing high-end setup, this isn't actually going to work really nicely for you. You need better cable. You probably need a higher end DVD player because people use those fairly often at the time. You need all of these extra things to make the most of your purchase. So you commit to one thing and then they keep adding on to it. It's especially frustrating if they're going to get you to commit to something and then they tell you that actually the thing that you want and that you've said yes to can't go through unless you do these additional things. And usually that's small increments because, again, it seems reasonable to add something small. And then before you know it, you're walking out the door with a new DVD player and a new surround sound system and those stupid $200 cables that nobody actually needs and a power supply system and all of those things. So that's lowballing with that initial commitment. So you might think of some examples of how all of these might come up in everyday life. But I love looking at things like commercials trying to get you to donate to charities or people trying to sell you things, especially in stores. Very interesting to go into. And I especially love going to places that have commissions because they are really, really good at this. And again, from the outside now, it's easier to see these things in action. Our next little bit is getting into conformity. Now, conformity is when we start doing what we see other people do. Usually it's because of normative influence, where we're judging our behavior based on theirs. So we take others' behavior as the norm. And then if we're sort of doubting our own actions, we're going to default to matching them. And conformity can become especially problematic if we're matching behavior that is maybe extreme or atypical. But if that's all we're seeing in a given condition, we're more likely to match it. So we'll go along with the group, even if we technically know better. And there are some really awesome psychology studies on this. We'll talk about this one on the slide, and then we'll talk about one other one because it's too cool not to share. But in this case, they have a standard test. They're going to sit you in a room and they're going to have, say, you on your own or you with up to 5 or 10 other people. But you don't realize that you are the only actual participant. All the others are confederates, those actors that you can hire to come in and help out. Usually it's whatever undergraduate volunteers we can wrangle into a room. And we say, all right, all of you are participants and we're going to get you to do a matching technique or a matching task. So I'm going to show you a line. And then I'm going to take away that line and show you a bunch of comparison lines. And I need you to tell me which one is the closest match to the standard that was shown to begin with. So you think that it's a perceptual test. But if we make you go last and you get to watch 4 or 5 or more other people all say that it's really close to line C, even though it is clearly not the same as line C, people are more likely to actually end up matching what the rest of the group has said. You sort of sit there and go, I must be missing something. I must be seeing this wrong. You can't have 9 other people saying that this is the right answer. I can't be the only one seeing this, so I'm going to go with the group. And people will do this fairly often in a lot of different cases. My other one that's really, really cool is they've had people come in, and as always, you have Confederates, you have actors, and you get people to wait in a room. So you're told that you're all participants, you're waiting to participate in some psychological study, not realizing that as soon as you walked in, it started. And so you sit in a waiting room. And as you're sitting there, they're going to pump, usually fog, but it looks like smoke under the door. And people in the room, those actors, are not going to react to it. And you see how long our participants will sit in a room that looks like it's filling with smoke before they get up and respond. And if the actors have no reaction whatsoever, those participants will sit there for an uncomfortably long amount of time, usually looking around, kind of waiting for somebody else to respond, but they are reluctant to take action if everyone else is treating it as a normal situation. So there's all sorts of studies that have looked at things like this, where people will suppress their own instinctive responses. They'll suppress what they know is the right response because of the performance of others and wanting to fit in and conform to match that group behavior. Now, of course, there are lots of things that affect this. I talked about varying the size of the groups. If it's you and one other person, you're not really super influenced. You're pretty much going to say your own thing because it's not really a group that you're matching, it's just one other person. But if you get 5 or more people that are going against your own instincts, then you're a lot more likely to conform. So the more people in that group, the more likely you are to give up on your own individual responses to match the rest of the group. And oftentimes, if you ask people sort of what's going on, it's something like they don't want to stir things up. They don't want to go against people. They don't want to sort of hold the group back in making a decision. They're just going to go with it. We also see that if there is even one other person who disagrees or dissents with that group statement, all of a sudden you feel like you can say something different too. So if we had our group of 10 and you have one person that says A, you are then comfortable to say A as well. But if everybody else said C, that's when you sort of hold yourself back. This is especially important. So if that person who goes against the group is really confident in going against them, if they're sort of wishy-washy and uncertain, you might not be as comfortable to say something yourself, but you also look at how the group responds to them. Because if people get mad at somebody who goes against all of what they've said, you are then less likely to go against them yourself because you've seen that there can be punishment, there can be consequences for going against the group. So you can see how this might prevent people from speaking up in group scenarios. This is also interesting because we again have an effective culture, and this is the standard individualistic versus collectivist. Individualistic cultures are a little bit more comfortable in speaking up for themselves, whereas collectivists are more likely to want to match that group, to belong, and not sort of set everybody else off. So it's kind of interesting to see that those things can have an effect. I also like mentioning something called groupthink, which is effectively the extreme version of conformity. But this is what happens when people in a group setting almost end up caught up in that group setting. So when you start talking about things like the mob mentality or people completely ignoring sound logic and making really poor decisions as a group, this is something that is usually brought up. So what happens? Why do we behave so weirdly in groups? We'll run through a couple of these. There are more examples and sort of descriptions here, but to hit some of the high points, talking about the illusion of invulnerability. Basically, when we're in a group, we identify as part of that group. And again, people like to feel positive. We like to feel like we're good and right and just. So once we're part of that group must be good and right and just. So we must be doing the right thing. And nothing could go wrong because we are the people in the right. We're strong and smart, we're the best, and therefore our choices are the best. This also ties into that belief in inherent morality. Again, I'm part of this group, I'm a good person, therefore our group is good and our actions are just. We can have collective rationalization. This is where we sort of focus on our own opinions and we start dismissing anything that goes against the group. So we don't want people to speak up against us. We also sometimes use things like us versus them mentality. This can also tie into things like our stereotypes and discrimination, where you start saying, well, if we're right and we're the best, other people don't know what they're talking about. So we can dismiss their opinions. Anyone outside of our group doesn't matter. And this can lead us to some of those stereotype views, that in-group versus out-group, where we'd have negative opinions and homogenized views of those outside of our correct grouping. Then when we start looking at us and our behavior within a group, you can have that pressure where if people disagree and are told off for it, you then feel less likely to disagree. So we basically control people's behaviors, make them unlikely to speak against us, and now we all have the same opinion. And we're convinced that our opinion is right because we're all agreeing on it. So that self-censorship comes in because once we've seen others sort of get put down for speaking out, I don't want to speak out, and I start doubting myself. Well, if everybody else has agreed, maybe I'm wrong, and I don't want to speak up because nobody else has spoken up. And that's where we get that illusion of unanimity. Basically, nobody else has spoken up, therefore we all agree on this topic. Nobody is questioning this. I'm the only one questioning it, so I'm just going to go with the flow, which doesn't take into account the fact that maybe everybody is sitting there going, this seems ridiculous. This seems completely like unhinged, but I'm going with it because nobody else has spoken up. You can have everyone in the group doing that, but if nobody says anything, you keep going forward with that commitment. And then the last one are these self-appointed mind guards. And these are when individuals within the group, they're going to step up and enforce that going along with the group. So these are the people who might lash out if you challenge whoever's in charge or if you challenge the group mentality. And that helps sort of enforce that people won't speak out. So all of these, again, you can read with more detail. All of these are sort of working together to keep people within a group sort of sticking to whatever their decision is. And if you start looking into like research on this, this can get into things like our Milgram's obedience studies, which we'll talk about momentarily, but people basically follow stuff blindly. We also can look at things like if you watch documentaries on the Challenger disaster, that's one of those cases where when you look at their discussions leading up to the explosion of the shuttle Challenger, basically they knew that there was a problem. If you followed it at all, they had O-rings, basically a component that connected the fuel tanks, I believe. They knew that there was a potential for a fault because their fuel is extra cold and when they freeze, they're brittle. And that's exactly what happened. It launched, those failed, everything exploded. But people knew that was a risk. And as a group setting, they dismissed external experts raising concerns. They sort of suppressed people within the group who raised concerns, and they were convinced that nothing could go wrong. They wanted to meet their deadline, and disagreeing, arguing about it was going to sort of push them back and make them look bad. So they barreled forward on that. So that's one of those examples where groupthink can lead to pretty awful outcomes. And of course, you can think of this in much smaller settings. Think about doing a group project. Somebody is really committed to a topic. You don't necessarily love it, but nobody else has spoken out against it. So you're like, yeah, let's do it. It'll be fine. And then it's a terrible topic and a terrible presentation, which you knew from the beginning, but you never said anything. You can frame it with some of these topics there too. So I always like mentioning this one because it's a really interesting concept. Then I did hint we'd talk obedience. So obedience is our tendency to do what powerful people tell us to do. So now it's not specifically matching group behaviors. It's actually more about following orders. And this can relate to that group setting though, because you can have the leader of the group, the person who has sort of more say in our decisions. So it can have that group setting as well. But specifically, when we care about that obedience process, it's all about how that leader, that person in charge, can directly influence your behavior. So if you start looking at following those orders, especially if others follow those orders, and that is our new normal, that is where those social norms are coming in, you fall into that role a lot more easily. You obey, you go along with it because that's what's supposed to happen. So, Milgram's obedience studies are the standard. We mentioned this before back when we talked ethics, because this is one of those sort of flagship unethical studies. And the long story short here is Milgram set it up to try and understand basically why people had gone along with really atrocious orders during the Holocaust. They wanted to see how what seemed like normal everyday people had gone and sort of worked in these camps and just followed orders. How the heck could someone normal do that? They basically wanted to see if it was something specific to that group, to training, to something, or if normal everyday people could be pushed to extremes. So, obviously, a pretty questionably ethical setup. And it gets worse because when they carried this out, there was a lot of deception going on. And they didn't do a great job of following up with people after the study to make sure that they weren't traumatized by the study, which, if you look into it, they absolutely were. But the setup was you'd bring in some participant and you'd have a confederate. So you have your actor. You'd tell them that, they are randomly assigned. One of them is going to be the person asking the questions, they're going to be the teacher. And then you have one person who's going to answer the questions. That ends up being your confederate. If the question answerer gets the answer wrong, which they're supposed to do, you as the teacher have to deliver a shock to try and correct their responses. So they framed it as we're looking at teaching techniques, we're looking at sort of teaching somebody to make correct responses. This is meant to be like a learning situation. But every time they get the wrong answer, you have to increase the intensity of the shock that you're delivering. And they have these fancy, sort of intense looking boards, and they're labeled sort of how extreme these shocks get. And when people started hearing that our actor, who wasn't actually receiving shocks, would be doing things like yelping with how painful it is or crying out how much it hurts, they wanted to see when people started saying, I won't continue. And they've done tons of iterations of this. So they've done it where you have your actor in the room, where you can actually see them acting like they've been shocked, like they're in pain. You can have them somewhere else, maybe watching them on a video monitor, but you can still hear them. They've also done different iterations of who's telling you that you have to keep doing this. So you might have somebody official looking, a guy in a lab coat with a clipboard, who looks very official and in charge. Or you can have somebody who looks a little bit less in charge, who's maybe receiving instructions from the authority out of the room. And all of those things end up having an effect on how likely you are to continue. So, what does it actually end up looking like? As always, I love borrowing slides or figures from other classes, but this one does a great job showing what those shocks were labeled as, basically showing you how extreme it would get. And then we have the percentage of people who commanded or who obeyed the command at each of these shock levels. So as this line drops, we're seeing that people are dropping off. They start refusing to obey. But at the beginning, people are going to continue even when we have sort of that reaction to pain. And if we look over here, this one here is once we've gone to the level of stuff labeled dangerous, and the person has gone from agonized screaming to silence. And we're still at about 65% of people persisted at this point in the original study. And so they looked at this, and the interpretation was, holy crap, people are obeying an authority figure to the point where, to their mind, they've killed somebody, or at least knocked them unconscious. This is intense and supports that idea that everyday people could be pushed to do sort of unspeakable and heinous crimes. From the ethical perspective, imagine going home after this study and not being told that there were no shocks delivered, because that's what they failed to do, not wanting it to get out, where people would talk about this study and share that it was an act. So the first bunch of participants left feeling like they had actually hurt somebody, with no follow-up, I might add. But what it tells us about obedience is that you can absolutely have normal, everyday people who showed up for what should have been just a psych experiment, delivering theoretical shocks to people. Now, I did mention that they had a lot of iterations of this. So the remoteness or closeness of the victim definitely plays a role. If you're seeing somebody suffering at the hands of your actions, you're a lot more likely to say no sooner. But if it's someone elsewhere, someone maybe you're seeing through a video monitor or not seeing at all, maybe just hearing, that extra remoteness makes you more likely to continue obeying. You're not as bothered by it. We also find the closeness and legitimacy of your authority figure plays a role. So that guy in a lab coat with a clipboard in the room is going to be very good at persisting and pushing you to continue obeying. But if you have sort of a floppy grad student who's in there with board shorts and, flip-flops, you're a lot more likely to say no sooner. So they're relaying somebody else's orders. I'm not obeying this guy. If they do things like reminding you that you're not the person making the decision, they call it the cog in the wheel because you are just somebody who's following orders. This isn't on you, this is on whoever gave that command. And that's actually one of the justifications that you get from a lot of people who have followed orders that led to really bad outcomes. So soldiers who did awful things in the war, they'll often say things like, well, I was just following orders. That's my job. I'm supposed to do this. So that wasn't on me. I just was a cog in that machine. So this is somebody else's fault. It's not mine. And as you can distance yourself from that responsibility, you're more likely to persist. We also see some personal characteristics, things like political orientation, even occupation and religious beliefs can make people more or less likely to conform. One really cool thing, though, is that there was no sex differences here. So men, women didn't matter. Everybody performed sort of about the same, because usually they would have expected that people who are maybe more concerned about the well-being of others, which is typically what we'll see with women in studies like this, should have sort of pushed back sooner, but there was reluctance to push back against an authority figure, which might actually have come from, at the time, it was pretty much done only with men as the people commanding and giving the orders. So all sorts of social stuff tied up in there as well. But a very interesting thing to look into, but again, usually talked about for the ethical ramifications. All right, so that was all about belongingness and acceptance. So going along with things so that you are matching the people around you, fitting in with society and groups. We also have accuracy-based social influence, where accuracy is your motivation. So here you want to believe what is true and avoid believing what is false. We like to be right. And we'll see that that want to be correct and the need to have been correct all along is another motivating factor here. And again, we've heard of this multiple times in a bunch of different contexts because that is something kind of inherent to humans. We don't want to be shown wrong, even if we probably should adjust our stance with new information coming to light. So the first thing here is this informational influence. So kind of like normative influence where, we made our decisions based on what everyone else is doing. Here, informational influence is when another person's behavior provides information about what is good or right. So this could be if you're around a friend group and they all have similar opinions on a particular topic, especially if there's lots of information to back up those opinions, you are more inclined to then agree with that opinion. So if I find, again, I mention this all the time, most of my friends are psych majors, people who teach psychology, people who do research in psychology. So we have a particular background. And because we talk about and read the same things and teach the same classes and do the same textbook stuff, we tend to have similar opinions and information available to us, which means that it's pretty easy where if one of them says something about something I might not be an expert on, I'm pretty inclined to trust them and believe it myself, even if I don't look it up. So surrounded by that kind of information, you might be very inclined to go along with it. And you can imagine being in different settings, you might be more influenced by those opinions from other people. So important terms related to this, attitude and belief. And I like looking at the summary of attitudes tell us what we should do, and beliefs are going to tell us how we should do it. So our attitude is some enduring, either positive or negative evaluation of an object or an event. So this could be something like, I've looked at this thing and I've made this determination that this is how this works. And then I could say my belief based on that attitude, I feel positively or negatively towards this thing. I have a belief that this thing is good. And that I should maybe buy more of this thing. I love using the example of, say, brand loyalty. So you think that a company is good or bad, and you've gained some information. Maybe people have talked about how good or bad for the environment or for their employees a particular company is. And based on that information, you have that attitude towards it. And then you believe that you should act a particular way towards that. So these are, again, closely related concepts, but it's all about how we're thinking and sort of processing information and then deciding what we do with that information. Now, of course, there's going to be persuasion here. You might have an opinion, but people like to persuade you to their opinion. Again, hanging out with scientifically minded people, it's really fun to try and debate two sides of a particular subject. And the more stupid the subject, the better. I've seen games like you're going to talk about the best piece of furniture. So argue against different types of chairs being better or worse than each other, and you have to persuade the rest of the group to your side of the argument. One of my friends, Dr. Scully, her ice-breaking event for her seminar classes is she picks a stupid question and sets the class loose on each other. So I think this year she opened with, what is the best fruit? And you can't leave until we've come to consensus, and then set them loose on each other to debate the best and worst fruits. And I think the consensus was watermelon this year, but the process of getting there is always different. So persuading and arguing and giving that sort of logical leading people to information, that's the component we're getting at here. Now, with that, we have something called the elaboration likelihood model of persuasion, which that's a mouthful. But this is basically saying that we believe that there are two broad approaches that you can take when trying to persuade someone to your side of an argument. So you can call these the two routes of persuasion. The first being our central route persuasion, and the second being our peripheral route persuasion. Now, of course, each gets their own definitions on a separate slide. So central route persuasion is when we're going with logic and reason. I am taking this head on. So if I have good evidence and strong arguments, I can be more likely to persuade someone to my point of view. So maybe you don't have a strong opinion on something, and I know all the facts. I just watched a documentary or read a book or teach a class, and boy, can I lay out all of these studies that support my side of things. Especially if that other person isn't really committed to their point of view, that can be a very persuasive role. The one thing to consider here, though, is if that person is really committed, you need very strong evidence to shift their sort of opinion on the topic. You also want to make sure that your information is something that's strong and reliable and trustworthy, because if they can poke holes in your logic and arguments, it's a lot less convincing. So this one can work, but under certain conditions. And that's going to hold. Our peripheral route persuasion also is going to need to work in some situations, won't be working so well in others. But instead of applying to logic and reasoning and sort of more of a laying out all of your facts, this is something that appeals a lot more to habit and emotion. So in this case, maybe you're going to sort of emotionally activate somebody and get them more likely to connect to one argument or another. This peripheral route ends up working better when people aren't particularly motivated to weight the evidence and to actually analyze the arguments. And if you want to get really controversial and looking into stuff yourself, I highly recommend looking at political debates, because sometimes you will have a very charismatic speaker who talks really passionately and throws things out there, but in terms of, say, facts and logic and rational reasoning, there might not be a lot of substance there. So either of these can be very powerful depending on the target audience, depending on the person who's trying to use them, and depending on the topic that you're talking about. So again, I love framing this in terms of debates. It could also be things like brand loyalty, whatever you want. But yeah, used in a lot of different ways. Next, getting into consistency. So I've mentioned before, people like to be accurate. People like to be sort of right, and we tend to prefer consistency because if we consistently have the same opinion, if we have sort of the same stance all the time, that gives us the illusion that we are then accurate. because our assumption is if this is my opinion and this has always been my opinion, I've been consistent across time and I was right to start and I continue sticking to it, I must have continued to be right. So I would equate consistency and accuracy. But with all that we've talked about in terms of human bias and behavior, by now you should kind of ask some questions about that, because people are resistant to anything that comes in and challenges our existing beliefs. If we have new pieces of evidence coming in that go against something we're already set on, we tend to dismiss or underweight that evidence because we want to be consistent, we want to have been right. So we actually end up sort of enforcing consistency to try and give that illusion of accuracy, even though the two aren't necessarily telling us that we were right to begin with. But it's just one of those inherent things with humans where we don't like to change our opinions. So yeah, we are highly motivated to be consistent and don't like making those changes. Now, we run into cognitive dissonance, which is an unpleasant state that we'll encounter if we recognize inconsistency between our actions, attitudes, and beliefs. Now, this could be something like, I actually hold two inconsistent beliefs. And maybe if you're not sort of thinking about that, you don't realize that these two things are actually related to one another. You can sort of run into, it wasn't causing problems until somebody pointed it out. So again, you can look at, say, political debates, things like, trying to think of an example. If you go for people who want to support sort of social well-being, so people who want to build stuff up, but they won't donate to programs that will do that because that's not my responsibility, somebody else should be doing that. You could frame that as two sort of opposing ideas of, if you want things to improve, you should support the things that make things improve. But if you frame them internally, cognitively, as unrelated issues, there isn't any dissonance because they're separate opinions. But if it is pointed out, or if you come to the realization that the two things are related and are opposing, that's when we get that discomfort. You can also have things like, I can have an internal understanding, I can have an opinion on a particular thing, but maybe my actions don't match that. So maybe you are really against some big box corporation. You absolutely hate Walmart for a whole bunch of reasons. But if you really, really need a whole bunch of cheap Halloween candy, Walmart is your only place to shop. In that case, your opinion is now sort of in dissonance with your actions. And if you don't think too much about it, that's not necessarily a problem. But as you start digging into it, it can make you uncomfortable. And of course, people don't like being uncomfortable. We want to have been right. We don't like inconsistency, and therefore we can do some stuff to change that out. So, of course, the healthy way to do this would be to come to that realization of, hey, I thought this, but I do this. Maybe my thoughts need to change to match my actions. Or maybe you're going to go the less healthy way and try and explain away your actions. Something like, I'm going to ignore these inconsistencies, or I'm going to justify or rationalize this in some way. So maybe the whole smoking is bad. So you know that there are studies showing cancer is linked to smoking. And you'd say, okay, I know that it's bad, but I still smoke occasionally. And you'd say, all right, well, yeah, it's bad, but I only do it on occasion. It's never had a negative side effect on me. It's very unlikely that it would affect me, and therefore it's not bad for me. So you've now rationalized it, not necessarily in the most logical way, but it makes you feel better because now there's no longer dissonance in your understanding and your actions. So again, you can apply this in a bunch of different settings, but hopefully some of the examples help. So at the end here, I think I just threw in a bunch of concepts I couldn't slot in nicely in other places. So I've just called this behavior in groups because these are sort of phenomena that tend to show up when looking at group behaviors. One of these is the idea of de-individuation. Basically, as you're in a group, you tend to identify more as part of the group than as a separate individual. So that's that whole idea of the group is doing this, I'm going to defer to the group. My own actions and opinions are not really the important thing here. So that group identity becomes more important, so the individual identity becomes less important. So this is something they often end up talking about when looking at, say, riot behavior. So maybe you've heard the term mob mentality, where as a group, you just go with the flow. You follow everybody else, you have those sort of social norms, and you're going to have normative influence, and you just go with it. And sometimes when people step out of it, they're like, I don't even know what I was thinking. I would never do that myself. But as part of that group, that's what happened. So a loss of individuality and loss of sort of remembering that you are a separate individual can lead to this disinhibited behavior. So you don't hold yourself back, you just go with the group. One of the ways that you can actually try and alleviate some of this, and if you've looked at techniques, the advice for if you're ever caught up in a group setting, if you point out an individual, call them out as a separate person, that usually kind of knocks them out of that go with the flow and makes them realize that they are an individual. This is actually really important when looking at, say, an emergency situation. One of my friends was a 911 dispatcher. So you get all the training and stuff that goes with it. But in an emergency situation, people stand around and they're like, okay, somebody else can do this, which will come up in a moment. But if you point to someone and say, hey, you in the red shirt with the ball cap, I need you to do this. All of a sudden, they are an individual and they have responsibility. It's not diffuse and part of a group. It's not no longer their problem. You have now made it their problem on their own, and you're going to sort of make them more likely to do the action that you want them to do. So if you reduce those, so if you sort of give them more feelings of accountability and responsibility, you can go against this problem with de-individuation. So yeah, talking about why people feel like they can get away with bad behaviors and going with that group, they feel like they have anonymity. They're part of this larger group. They themselves don't stick out on their own, so they can get away with things. So yeah, interesting to note. That kind of relates to the bystander effect. We'll come back to social loafing. As I said, I just sort of stuck these all together and didn't think too much of order. But our bystander effect is that idea that someone is less likely to help if there are more people around. And usually when we talk about our sort of examples of this, you have the Kitty Genovese murders back in 1960s. But this was that story of somebody was murdered and it took a really long time. It was sort of a loud process. Lots of people heard it, but they say that, nobody called the cops, nobody acted, and they basically died because nobody took action. If you look into the actual story, people did call the cops. There were people who reported it. But when it first was talked about and released, they said that there was no reaction to it. Everyone ignored it, assuming someone else would call the cops. It wasn't that extreme. But we do still find that this bystander effect, the fact that people don't feel like it's their responsibility to act, is definitely a thing, just not to that extreme. But as you're in larger and larger groups, any one individual becomes less and less likely to help. So if you've ever done first aid training, which some of my jobs have made us do it repeatedly, because, in the 6 months, you've definitely forgotten everything. But they'll get you to do things like, okay, as someone who's trained in first aid, it is your responsibility to step in if something happens. You are obligated to help because you can help. So you're giving people that responsibility, you're putting that into play so that you don't have people standing back feeling like it's somebody else's role. So that's one way that you can actually help with it. Again, you can point to people and call them out and tell them that they need to help in a particular way, give them responsibility to prevent them from hanging back. And in a lot of these cases, with that sort of bystander effect, people are usually doing things like some of our group think processes of, well, I don't know what I'm doing. Somebody else must know what they're doing. I'll let someone who knows what's going on step in. But maybe you're all standing there going, I don't know what to do. And if you kind of work together, you might have helped, but everybody assumes someone else will take charge, and nobody does. So that's all related to this. Social loafing is something we have mentioned before. I always talk about this in terms of group projects. This is when you have those people who get by on the effort of others. So in a group setting, if you have a task that needs accomplishing, some people might put in more work, some people less. And basically, you can look at systems and see how much of that loafing can be tolerated. And the answer is it depends on the other group members. If you're in a group with somebody who is really motivated and wants to do a lot of work, and somebody who is just there to be there and wants the grade without any effort, you might tolerate a completely useless group member. This is the reason that the one class I do group work in, each person gets their own mark based on their own merits, having reported what they specifically do. Because social loafing, even if you don't intend to do it, there's almost always an unequal distribution of work. Then we have something called pluralistic ignorance, which is actually something I was just describing but forgot the term for. Again, I stuck these together. But this is when people fail to act because they're relying on social cues from others to guide their behavior without really realizing that everybody else is looking to everyone else to guide their behavior. So you all stand there waiting for somebody to know what to do, and none of you know what to do, so you're just waiting. So you can fail to act basically because you're relying on faulty social cues. Nobody else is responding, and therefore I don't feel like I should respond because I don't want to be in charge. But everybody else is waiting for someone to step up too. So you're all stationary because nobody has started. So yeah, you might not realize that others are also uncertain and not acting because of that uncertainty. So you definitely need to acknowledge that everybody might be confused and unsure. And then if we want to look at some of the things that affect when people do or don't help, I've already mentioned prior training, things like that can be really useful. Having someone step up and give you a role can make you more likely to help. The environment plays a huge role, and this might be something about sort of the social setting. So if you're in a rural area, you often know your neighbors, and you are therefore more likely to help because there's that feeling of community. It also works in more sort of collectivist cultures. But in an urban setting, it's a lot more, me and I am separate. I don't know anyone here, so I'm focusing on myself. Therefore, I'm less likely to help. Something interesting called the sense of common fate. Basically, if you are stuck with these people, so maybe you have everybody in a classroom, you might be more likely to help because you're all in this scenario together. You belong in this sort of unintentional group setting, and therefore you have that feeling of obligation to be part of that group. There's a bunch of studies where they look at subway cars. So if you have a bunch of people on a subway, and there's a medical emergency, someone within that car is much more likely to step up than if somebody had, say, had a medical emergency out on the street where you're not sort of stuck in that same environment. We also need to be able to perceive that help is needed. If you don't notice that somebody needs help, you won't help. Also, the severity of help needed. If somebody stumbled and dropped their books, you might not feel obligated to help. But if somebody stumbled and fell and is now bleeding, that might make you more likely to step in because now they need more help. Though, of course, having somebody bleeding is now maybe a potential risk you need to consider. So if there is a potential threat, so maybe somebody's aggressive, then you might be less likely, less inclined to step forward. This can also be something like if you look at who stops when you have a flat on the side of the road, some people might be unlikely to stop. Daytime, it's a lot less scary, a lot less dangerous than at night. But also, if you're stopping for a man versus a woman, I know I would be a lot more comfortable stopping to help a woman, especially at night. But that's individual sort of evaluations of threat and danger. So all sorts of social connotations there. And then the last one is personal factors. Every individual might be more or less inclined to help. It can be stuff in the moment. I'm in a rush. I can't help right now. Even if I wanted to, I am sort of committed to something else. I've helped people in the past and it's gone well, so I'm more likely to help. That personal training, taking classes where you now know how people tend to react, all of that might play a role. But I like talking about each of these because it's kind of neat to note and something that can adjust your behavior in the future now that you know it.